their wings as if they had half a mind to fly along. But then an old mother goose would always say to them: "Now, don't be silly! Those creatures will have to suffer both hunger and cold." There was a young gander whom the wild geese had fired with a passion for adventure. "If another flock comes this way, I'll follow them," said he. Then there came a new flock, who shrieked like the others, and the young gander answered: wait a minute, I'm coming." He spread his wings and raised himself into the air, but he was so unaccustomed to flying that he fell to the ground again. At any rate the wild geese must have heard his call, for they turned and flew back slowly to see if he was coming. "Wait, wait!" he cried, and made another attempt to fly. All this the boy heard, where he lay on the hedge. "It would be a great pity," thought he, "if the big goosey gander should go away. It would be a big loss to father and mother if he was gone when they came home from church." When he thought of this, once again he entirely forgot that he was little and helpless. He took one leap right down into the goose flock, and threw his arms around the neck of the goosey gander. "Oh, no! You don't fly away this time, sir!" cried he. But just then the gander was considering how he should go to work to raise himself from the ground. He couldn't stop to shake the boy off; hence he had to go along with him, up in the air. They bore on toward the heights so rapidly that the boy fairly gasped, before he had time to think that he ought to let go his hold around the gander's neck. He was so high up that he would have been killed instantly if he had fallen to the ground. The only thing that he could do to make himself a little more comfortable was to try and get upon the gander's back, and there he wriggled himself forthwith, but not without considerable trouble. And it was not an easy matter, either, to hold himself secure on the slippery back between two swaying wings. He had to dig deep into feathers and down with both hands, to keep from tumbling to the ground. The big checked cloth. The boy had grown so giddy that it was a long while before he came to himself. The winds howled and beat against him, and the rustle of feathers and swaying of wings sounded like a whole storm. 13 geese flew around him, flapping their wings and honking. They danced before his eyes and they buzzed in his ears. He didn't know whether they flew high or low, or in what direction they were travelling. After a bit he regained just enough sense to understand that he ought to find out where the geese were taking him. But this was not so easy, for he didn't know how he should ever muster up courage enough to look down. He was sure he'd faint if he attempted it. The wild geese were not flying very high because the new travelling companion could not breathe in the very thinnest air. For his sake they also flew a little slower than usual. At last the boy just made himself cast one glance down to earth. Then he thought that a great big rug lay spread beneath him, which was made up of an incredible number of large and small checks. "Where in all the world am I now?" he wondered. He saw nothing but check upon check. Some were broad and ran crosswise, and some were long and narrow all over. There were angles and corners. Nothing was round and nothing was crooked. "What kind of big checked cloth is this that I'm looking down on?" said the boy to himself without expecting anyone to answer him. But instantly the wild geese who flew about him called out: "Fields and meadows! Fields and meadows!" Then he understood that the big checked cloth he was travelling over was the flat land of southern Sweden, and he began to comprehend why it looked so checked and multicoloured. The bright green checks he recognized first. They were rye fields that had been sown in the fall, and had kept themselves green under the winter snows. The yellowish gray checks were stubble fields, the remains of the oat crop which had grown there the summer before. The brownish ones were old clover meadows, and the black ones deserted grazing lands or ploughed up fallow pastures. The brown checks with the yellow edges were undoubtedly beech tree forests. For in these you'll find the big trees which grow in the heart of the forest, naked in the winter, while the little beech trees which grow along the borders keep their dry, yellowed leaves way into the spring. There were also dark checks with gray centers. These were the large, built up estates encircled by the small cottages with their blackening straw roofs, and their stone divided land plots. And then there were checks green in the middle with brown borders. These were the orchards, where the grass carpets were already turning green, although the trees and bushes around them were still in their nude, brown bark. The boy could not keep from laughing when he saw how checked everything looked. But when the wild geese heard him laugh, they called out, kind of reprovingly: "Fertile and good land! Fertile and good land!" The boy had already become serious. "To think that you can laugh you, who have met with the most terrible misfortune that can possibly happen to a human being!" thought he, and for a moment he was pretty serious; but it wasn't long before he was laughing again. Now that he had grown somewhat accustomed to the ride and the speed, so that he could think of something besides holding himself on the gander's back, he began to notice how full the air was of birds flying northward. And there was a shouting and calling from flock to flock. "So you came over to day?" shrieked some. "Yes," answered the geese. "How do you think the spring is getting on?" "Not a leaf on the trees and ice cold water in the lakes," came back the answer. When the geese flew over a place where they saw any tame, half naked fowl, they shouted: "What's the name of this place? What's the name of this place?" Then the rooster cocked their heads and answered: "Its name's Lillegard this year, the same as last year." Most of the cottages were probably named after their owners, which is the custom in Skåne. But instead of saying "This is Per Matsson's" or "Ola Bosson's," the roosters hit upon the kind of names which to their way of thinking were more appropriate. Those who lived on small farms and belonged to poor cottages cried: "This place is called Grain Scarce." And those who belonged to the poorest hut dwellers screamed: "The name of this place is Little to Eat, Little to Eat, Little to Eat." The big, well cared for farms got high sounding names from the roosters, such as Lucky Meadows, Äggberga, and Moneyville. But the roosters on the great landed estates were too high and mighty to condescend to anything like jesting. One of them crowed and called out with such gusto that it sounded as if he wanted to be heard clear up to the sun: "This is Herr Dybeck's estate, the same this year as last year, this year as last year." A little further on strutted one rooster who crowed: "This is Svanholm. Surely all the world knows that." The boy observed that the geese did not fly straight forward, but zigzagged hither and thither over the whole south country, just as though they were glad to be in Skåne again, and wanted to pay their respects to every separate place. They came to one place where there were a number of big, clumsy looking buildings with great, tall chimneys, and all around these were a lot of smaller houses. "This is Jordberga sugar refinery," cried the roosters. The boy shuddered as he sat there on the goose's back. He ought to have recognized this place, for it was not very far from his home. Here he had worked the year before as a watch boy; but, to be sure, nothing was exactly like itself when one saw it like that, from up above. And think just think! Osa, the goose girl, and little Mats, who were his comrades last year, indeed, the boy would have been glad to know if they still were anywhere about here. Fancy what they should have said, had they suspected that he was flying over their heads! Soon Jordberga was lost to sight, and they travelled toward Svedala and Skaber Lake, and back again over Göringe Kloster and Häckeberga. The boy saw more of Skåne in this one day than he had ever seen before, in all the years that he had lived. Whenever the wild geese